Husband threw me against the wall at our anniversary party while his mother smiled proudly. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. The back of my skull hit the antique oak paneling with a sickening crack, but what truly broke me was the sight of my mother-in-law smiling in the doorway. It was our 5th anniversary, a night supposed to celebrate love, but the metallic taste of blood in my mouth told a different story. I slid down the expensive wallpaper, my vision blurring, trying to process the sheer violence of what just happened. My husband, Greg, stood over me, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. This was the man who brought me coffee in bed, the man who charmed my clients, the golden boy of local high society. Now, his eyes were cold, entirely empty of the man I thought I knew. I gasped for air, the sharp pain in my ribs making every breath a battle. I looked past him, hoping for help. Eleanor, his mother, was standing right there in the hallway. She didn't scream. She didn't rush to my side or berate her son. She just stood there in her custom silk gown, her manicured hands neatly folded, wearing a tight, deeply satisfied smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally gotten exactly what she wanted. My name is Clara. I'm 29, and I built a highly successful boutique marketing agency from absolutely nothing. I clawed my way up from a working-class neighborhood, proud of every single dollar I earned. I thought my marriage to Greg was a fairy tale, the ultimate reward for my hard work. I believed I had stepped into a world of elegance and security. But staring up at Eleanor's approving smirk as I bled onto her priceless Persian rug, the horrifying truth slammed into me harder than the wall. This wasn't a marriage. It was a perfectly designed, high-society death trap. They didn't love me. They were using me, and I had just outlived my illusion of safety. My mind raced, panic warring with a sudden, icy clarity. If I reacted now, if I fought back or screamed for the guests just down the hall, I wouldn't make it out of this estate with my life or my business intact. I had to be smart. I had to survive. As Greg took a threatening step closer, raising his hand again, I made a silent vow. I would play dead until I could absolutely destroy them both. I never saw the trap being built. 5 years ago, Greg swept into my life like a cinematic hero. He was handsome, superficially charming, and paid attention to me in a way no one ever had. I was working 70-hour weeks to launch my marketing agency, surviving on cheap takeout and sheer willpower. He took me to Michelin-star restaurants, listened intently to my ambitions, and promised to be my sanctuary. I was so exhausted, so desperate for a safe harbor, that I eagerly ignored the subtle warning signs. The isolation happened so gradually it felt like love. First, it was complaints about my friends being too loud or disrespectful. Then, it was Eleanor. My wealthy, status-obsessed mother-in-law made her disdain for my working-class roots painfully clear from day one. At our rehearsal dinner, she loudly mistook my mother for the catering staff. When I confronted Greg, he played the peacemaker. "She's just old-fashioned, Clara," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "She loves you in her own way. Just give it time." But her way of loving involved constant, cutting insults delivered with a sweet, aristocratic smile. She criticized my clothes, my posture, and especially my business. "A woman's true agency is supporting her husband," she'd remark, sipping her imported tea. Over the years, I slowly stopped seeing my childhood friends. I stopped visiting my family as much, exhausted by the inevitable arguments it caused with Greg. I was totally isolated in Eleanor's opulent, antique-filled estate where we lived temporarily to save for our dream home. I was a bird in a gilded cage, completely unaware that the door was securely locked from the outside. I convinced myself that Greg's occasional bursts of anger were just the stress of managing his family's vast investment portfolio. I made excuses for his controlling behavior, framing it as protectiveness. I was so incredibly blind. I traded my independence for a beautifully crafted illusion of elite security. But as my marketing business unexpectedly exploded in profitability, becoming highly lucrative, the atmosphere in the estate subtly shifted. Their smiles grew tighter, the rules became stricter, and the invisible chains around my life pulled taut. I had no idea I was the only one actually making any money. The week of our 5th anniversary was a masterclass in psychological torture. Eleanor had completely hijacked the event planning. turning what should have been an intimate celebration of our marriage into a massive, garish display of her own supposed wealth. "We must maintain appearances, Clara," she snapped when I suggested a smaller guest list. "The right people need to see that the family is thriving." She ordered 500 bottles of vintage champagne and hired a string quartet, charging everything to a credit card she explicitly demanded I pay off. Just a temporary cash flow issue with the trust, Greg had lied smoothly, refusing to meet my eyes. His behavior had become increasingly volatile in the days leading up to the party. He was drinking heavily, snapping at the estate staff, and pacing the halls late at night. The first real red flag of physical violence happened 3 days before the event. I had gently reminded him about a meeting with my agency's biggest client. He spun around, his face dark red with sudden rage, and forcefully slammed his fist into the drywall, inches from my face. "Do not tell me what to do," he screamed, his spittle hitting my cheek. I froze, terrified. He immediately crumbled, fake crying and blaming the immense pressure of his family's legacy. I forgave him, deeply ashamed of my own fear. I spent the next 2 days walking on eggshells, meticulously avoiding anything that might trigger another outburst. I let Eleanor dictate my wardrobe for the party, a suffocating, deeply uncomfortable designer gown that felt like armor. I told myself that once the party was over, things would go back to normal. We just needed a vacation, a break from his mother's oppressive presence. On the night of the anniversary, the estate was packed with the city's elite. I plastered on a fake smile, accepting congratulations from people who barely knew my name. Greg was playing the perfect, doting husband for the cameras, keeping a tight grip on my waist. The tension radiating off him was palpable, a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. I tried to slip away for a moment of quiet, but he followed me. The party was in full, deafening swing downstairs. The clinking of crystal glasses and the pretentious laughter of high society echoed up the grand staircase. I had merely retreated to the second-floor hallway to catch my breath and adjust the agonizingly tight straps of my gown. Greg cornered me near Eleanor's private study. His breath reeked of expensive scotch and raw fury. "Where do you think you're going?" he hissed, grabbing my upper arm hard enough to leave immediate bruises. "I just needed some air," I whispered, trying to pull away without causing a scene. "You're embarrassing me," he snarled, his grip tightening painfully. It was a fabricated, entirely trivial argument. I hadn't spoken to anyone inappropriately. I hadn't done anything wrong. But he needed a target for his boiling rage. "You think you're so superior with your little marketing company, don't you? You think you don't need us." Before I could even formulate a response, he snapped. He grabbed me by both shoulders and violently threw me backward. The back of my skull hit the antique oak paneling with a sickening crack. I collapsed to the floor, white-hot pain shooting down my spine. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I gasped, entirely paralyzed by the shock of the physical assault. That was when I saw her. Eleanor stepped out of the shadows of her study, entirely unbothered by the violence. She looked down at me, broken and bleeding on her floor, and smiled proudly. "She needed to learn her place, Gregory," Eleanor said coldly, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "Make sure she cleans herself up before dessert is served." She stepped delicately over my legs and walked back toward the grand staircase, leaving her son standing over me like a conquering king. The sheer, monstrous nature of their dynamic was suddenly blindingly clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a long-established pattern of control and dominance. They viewed me not as a family member, but as a stubborn animal that needed to be violently broken and trained. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back tears of agony and pure, unadulterated terror. If I didn't find a way out tonight, they would eventually kill me. I woke up the next morning in our opulent bedroom, every single muscle in my body screaming in agony. The back of my head throbbed with a relentless, sickening pulse, and a massive, dark purple bruise bloomed vividly across my left shoulder. I dragged myself to the en-suite bathroom, terrified of my own reflection. I looked like a completely broken doll. As I stared at the damage, the bedroom door opened. Greg walked in, carrying a silver tray with coffee and a single red rose. The performance had officially begun. He dropped to his knees beside the bathtub, burying his face in his hands, producing loud, perfectly convincing sobs. "Clara, my God, I am so sorry," he wept, grasping my cold hand. I drank too much. The stress of the anniversary, the pressure. I slipped. I tripped and accidentally pushed you. Please tell me you know I would never intentionally hurt you. It was a breathtakingly audacious lie. He hadn't tripped. He had violently hurled me against the wall. But looking into his manic, desperate eyes, I realized the immense danger I was in. If I challenged his narrative, the violence would instantly return. I know, I whispered, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. It was an accident. Relief washed over his face, instantly replacing the fake tears. An hour later, Eleanor summoned me to the sunroom. She sipped her tea, her icy gaze dissecting my bruised appearance. Gregory tells me you had a clumsy fall last night, she stated flatly, not a question, but a firm directive. So unfortunate. Wear the high-collared silk blouse today. Cover it up and be a good wife. We have an image to maintain, Clara. We don't air dirty laundry. She slid a heavy, expensive diamond bracelet across the table, a physical gag order. I picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy weight of my complete subjugation. They were effortlessly rewriting history, fully expecting me to comply with my own psychological erasure. I nodded submissively, acting entirely broken and obedient. I let them believe they had successfully crushed my spirit. But beneath my submissive silence, a cold, calculating fire had finally ignited. The severe pain in my head wasn't subsiding. It was sharpening, accompanied by terrifying waves of dizziness. I knew I needed medical attention, but I couldn't risk Greg or Eleanor finding out. I waited until Greg left for his investment firm, and Eleanor was occupied with her weekly high society garden club meeting. I grabbed a large pair of sunglasses and slipped out the back door, practically running to my car. I drove to a sterile, brightly lit emergency room 2 towns over and called the only person I fully trusted, Sarah. My fierce childhood best friend arrived within 20 minutes, taking one look at my bruised face and bursting into angry tears. She had always seen right through Greg's charming facade. In the examination room, I told the doctor the absolute truth. I detailed the assault, ensuring every bruise, the minor concussion, and the precise mechanism of injury were meticulously documented in my official medical file. I need copies of everything, I told the doctor, my voice trembling but resolute. Sarah held my hand tightly. Clara, you can't go back there. You can come stay with me right now, she pleaded. But the cold, terrifying reality of my situation had finally crystallized in my mind. I can't just run, Sarah, I explained, fighting back tears. Eleanor is deeply connected. If I just leave, she will use her lawyers, her influence, and her money to completely destroy my marketing agency. She'll ruin my reputation and drain my accounts before I can even file the divorce papers. I needed massive, undeniable leverage. I needed to trap them so completely that they could never retaliate. I asked Sarah to buy a cheap, prepaid burner phone and rent a small, secure storage unit under her name. I'm going to find out exactly what they are hiding, I promised her, sliding the damning hospital reports into my bag. I drove back to the sprawling estate, the pain in my head momentarily eclipsed by a surge of pure adrenaline. I walked through the heavy front doors, ready to begin my secret war. That night, Greg drank himself into a heavy, snoring stupor, celebrating a supposed major market win. The moment his breathing deepened into an unbreakable rhythm, I carefully slipped out of bed. The estate was dead quiet, the antique grandfather clock ticking loudly in the hallway. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs as I crept downstairs toward Eleanor's private study. She always kept the heavy oak door locked, but over the years, I had quietly noticed where she hid the small brass key, inside a hollowed-out decorative book on the hallway console. My hands shook violently as I retrieved the key, the metal cold against my sweating palms. I unlocked the door and slipped inside, turning on a small, weak penlight. The study smelled of old paper and expensive perfume. I bypassed the obvious desk drawers and went straight for the heavy, antique filing cabinet in the corner. The top 2 drawers held meaningless social club rosters and charity receipts. But the bottom drawer was entirely different. It was secured with a modern, heavy-duty combination padlock. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to remember any numbers Eleanor favored. Her late husband's birth year? Nothing. Her own anniversary? Nothing. Then, I remembered her sickening pride in Greg. I dialed his exact date of birth and the time he was born, a detail she incessantly bragged about. The heavy lock clicked open. I exhaled a shaky breath and pulled the drawer open. Inside was a massive, heavily worn leather ledger and a stack of highly official-looking legal documents bearing the seal of a major commercial bank. I pulled out my secret burner phone and began furiously taking clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page. The dates, the massive loan amounts, the terrifying interest rates. I was so intensely focused that I almost missed the sound of heavy footsteps slowly descending the grand staircase. Panic violently seized my throat. Greg was awake. I frantically shoved the documents back, locked the heavy drawer, and killed the penlight, plunging myself into absolute darkness. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped right outside the door. The doorknob rattled aggressively, but the lock held firm. "Mother," Greg muttered sleepily, his voice slurred. "You in there?" I remained completely frozen, pressing my back flat against the cold filing cabinet, terrified he would hear the violent pounding of my heart. After a torturous, agonizing minute, he grunted and heavily lumbered off toward the kitchen. I waited until I heard the distant slam of the refrigerator before quietly slipping out, locking the study, and fleeing back to the bedroom. The next day, safely hidden in my office downtown, I meticulously reviewed the photos on the burner phone. What I uncovered completely shattered the illusion of their entire existence. Eleanor's precious, old money was entirely gone. It had been completely wiped out a decade ago by her late husband's horrific gambling addiction. She was effectively bankrupt, surviving entirely on massive, high-interest secret loans to maintain her elite social standing. But the most horrifying discovery was the incredibly complex legal document detailing Greg's grandfather's trust fund. The multi-million-dollar trust had a draconian morality clause. It would only vest and pay out to Greg if he remained stably and continuously married for exactly 5 full years. We had just celebrated our 5th anniversary. The payout was scheduled for the end of the month. But that wasn't all. To secure the massive loans keeping Eleanor afloat until the trust vested, she and Greg had fraudulently used my highly successful marketing agency as primary collateral, forging my signature on multiple commercial guarantees. If they defaulted, the bank would instantly seize my entire company. The sheer, calculating evil of it made me physically nauseous. They had actively targeted me. They needed a successful, working-class woman who would be grateful for their wealth and naive enough to let them manage the finances. They only kept me around to guarantee the trust fund and act as their unwitting financial shield. The violent assault wasn't just a loss of temper. It was the arrogance of criminals who believed they had finally crossed the finish line. They thought they had won, completely unaware that I now held the detonator. I immediately contacted Sarah, and she discreetly set up an emergency meeting with lawyer Vance, a fiercely intimidating, 50-something attorney renowned for his absolute ruthlessness in high-stakes divorces and financial fraud cases. We met in his heavily soundproofed downtown office. I slid the burner phone across his massive mahogany desk, displaying the photographs of the forged loan documents, the trust fund stipulations, and the hospital records detailing my physical abuse. Vance reviewed the evidence in absolute silence, his sharp eyes narrowing. When he finally looked up, his expression was utterly predatory. "Clara, this isn't just a divorce," Vance stated coldly. "This is massive federal wire fraud, identity theft, and severe domestic battery. If you just file for divorce now, they will instantly trigger the loans, bankrupt your agency, and drag this out in court for years until you are completely broken." I felt a terrifying wave of panic. "So what do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Vance leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "We don't file for divorce. We let them think they are perfectly safe. We use the next 3 weeks to quietly untangle your business from their fraudulent collateral. I will work with the federal authorities to secretly freeze their accounts the exact moment the trust fund attempts to disperse. But I need one more thing from you." He paused, looking at my fading bruises. "The hospital report is strong, but to ensure the police arrest them both immediately and deny bail, we need undeniable, recorded proof of their specific intent in the assault. We need a confession." The task felt incredibly impossible and overwhelmingly dangerous. I had to go back into that sprawling, suffocating estate. I had to smile at the man who violently threw me against a wall, and pour tea for the woman who smiled while I bled. I had to willingly step back into the terrifying lion's den and actively provoke them into revealing their true monstrous nature. The sheer psychological weight of the plan pressed heavily on my chest. I agreed to the terrifying plan, knowing one single mistake would cost my life. The next 2 weeks were an exercise in absolute psychological horror. I returned to the estate playing the role of the broken, terrified, and perfectly compliant wife. I cooked Greg's favorite meals, ironed his shirts, and kept my eyes submissively lowered whenever Eleanor entered the room. My sudden, complete obedience made them incredibly smug. Greg became bolder, casually tossing insults about my intelligence, while Eleanor treated me entirely like an unpaid servant, demanding I fetch her tea and organize her social calendar. Every single yes, Greg, and right away, Eleanor, felt like swallowing broken glass. The cognitive dissonance of kissing the man who brutally assaulted me made me violently ill every morning. But behind my blank, terrified eyes, I was meticulously executing the plan. During one of Eleanor's extensive spa days, Sarah helped me smuggle in 3 high-definition, audio-enabled hidden nanny cameras. We strategically installed them in the main living room, the grand hallway where the assault occurred, and directly inside Eleanor's private study, disguised as a decorative bookend. The cameras continuously recorded directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server managed by lawyer Vance. Meanwhile, Vance was quietly executing legal miracles behind the scenes, presenting the absolute proof of the forged signatures to the commercial bank. The bank, terrified of the impending massive federal fraud investigation, secretly agreed to quietly remove my marketing agency as collateral, transferring the massive toxic debt entirely back onto Eleanor and Greg's personal names without alerting them. The trap was being meticulously constructed right under their arrogant noses. But the tension was rapidly becoming completely unbearable. I wasn't sleeping. I was constantly hyperventilating in the shower, terrified they would discover the hidden cameras or notice the subtle changes in my banking passwords. The pressure was a physical weight, slowly crushing the breath out of my lungs. I needed to force the final confession before my nerves completely shattered. I decided to trigger the ultimate confrontation on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The estate was eerily quiet that Sunday. Eleanor was elegantly reading in the main living room, and Greg was nursing a hangover on the expensive leather sofa. I walked in, positioning myself perfectly within the clear frame of the hidden camera hidden in the bookshelf. I took a deep, terrifying breath and dropped my submissive act. "I want to talk about the trust fund," I stated loudly, my voice echoing in the large room. Greg immediately sat up, his face instantly darkening. Eleanor slowly lowered her book, her icy eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," she snapped. "I know about the morality clause," I continued, forcing myself to stand perfectly still. "I know you need me to stay married to you for 5 years to get the money. And I know about the massive loans secured against my business." Greg exploded off the sofa, aggressively marching toward me. "You stupid bitch, you've been snooping?" he roared, raising his hand exactly as he had on the night of the party. I didn't flinch. "Go ahead, hit me again," I challenged coldly. "Throw me against the wall like you did at the anniversary party. But if you touch me, I walk, and you lose millions." Greg stopped, his chest violently heaving, his fists tightly clenched. Eleanor scoffed loudly from her armchair, completely taking the bait. "Gregory, stop. She's not going anywhere," Eleanor sneered, stepping into the camera's view. "You are going to keep your mouth shut, Clara. You will smile, you will play the good wife, and we will take that money. Because if you try to leave, we will bankrupt your pathetic little agency and make sure you end up on the street. You exist here solely to secure our legacy. The wall was just a reminder of your actual place." Greg laughed cruelly, adding, "You're nothing without us. You think anyone cares if I roughed you up?" It was completely flawless. They had arrogantly confirmed the financial extortion, the massive fraud, and the violent physical assault in one terrifying, heavily recorded conversation. The trap was fully loaded. I immediately texted Vance a single word: "We have the absolute final proof." With the undeniable confession securely uploaded to Vance's servers, the final countdown began. The trust fund was scheduled to disperse exactly on the night of Eleanor's most prized event, the annual High Society Charity Gala. an incredibly opulent gathering of the city's wealthiest elite. Eleanor had practically forced me to be the public co-host, eager to parade her perfect, stable family, to ensure the trust executors had zero doubts about the marriage. "Make sure you wear the emerald necklace," Eleanor commanded the morning of the gala, her tone dripping with condescension. "We need to project absolute, undeniable prosperity tonight." I smiled sweetly, agreeing to every single demand. I spent the entire afternoon secretly coordinating with Lawyer Vance and a senior detective from the Financial Crimes Division. The plan was terrifyingly precise. Vance had legally timed the massive, secret asset freeze to hit Eleanor and Greg's accounts exactly at 8 p.m., the very moment Greg expected the trust fund millions to finally clear. Simultaneously, the police were staging unmarked vehicles just outside the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel where the gala was being held. I arrived at the venue wearing a stunning, heavily tailored red gown, looking completely untouchable. I stood next to Greg and Eleanor, warmly greeting billionaires, politicians, and socialites. At 7:55 p.m., I excused myself, claiming I needed to do a final check on the evening's multimedia presentation. I walked briskly to the AV control booth at the back of the massive ballroom, locking the heavy door behind me. I handed the panicked technician a custom USB drive and explicitly ordered him to play it exactly at 8 o'clock. My hands were completely steady. The time for hiding and surviving was over. It was time for executions. At exactly 8 p.m., Eleanor confidently stepped up to the crystal podium, tapping the microphone to command the attention of 300 elite guests. "Welcome, dear friends, to a night of immense prosperity and family legacy," she began, her voice echoing perfectly through the grand ballroom. Down in the crowd, Greg smiled smugly, checking his phone. Suddenly, his face drained of all color. The banking notification hadn't shown a massive deposit. It showed his accounts were entirely frozen by federal mandate. Before he could react, I hit the play button in the AV booth. The massive screens behind Eleanor didn't show the expected charity logos. Instead, they brightly flashed high-resolution images of the forged loan documents, clearly highlighting Eleanor and Greg's signatures. The ballroom instantly plunged into a shocked, dead silence. Then, the crisp, undeniable audio from the hidden nanny camera blasted through the expensive surround sound speakers. Eleanor's cruel, sneering voice filled the room. "You exist here solely to secure our legacy. The wall was just a reminder of your actual place." The video abruptly cut to Greg's arrogant face. "You think anyone cares if I roughed you up?" The elite crowd violently gasped. Women covered their mouths in pure horror. Men stepped away from Greg as if he were highly contagious. Eleanor froze at the podium, her perfectly maintained mask completely shattering into a look of absolute, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed illusion of her wealthy, aristocratic life was brutally disintegrating in front of every single person she desperately wanted to impress. They were undeniably exposed as broke, violent, fraudulent monsters. I stepped out of the AV booth and walked slowly down the center aisle, my red dress trailing behind me. I looked directly at Eleanor, who was desperately gripping the podium, shaking violently. Greg turned toward me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, absolute madness. He realized instantly that I was the architect of his total destruction. He let out a visceral, terrifying scream and violently lunged across the room. Greg didn't make it more than 5 feet. The heavy double doors of the grand ballroom violently burst open, and 4 plainclothes detectives stormed the floor. They tackled Greg hard against a beautifully decorated banquet table, sending expensive crystal champagne flutes shattering across the polished marble floor. "Gregory Vance, you are under arrest for severe domestic battery, felony wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft," the lead detective shouted over the chaotic screaming of the high society guests. Greg fought wildly, his handsome face contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl, but the heavy steel handcuffs quickly snapped tightly around his wrists. I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had violently thrown me against a wall be forcefully dragged out in front of his entire elite social circle. 2 other officers swiftly approached the podium. Eleanor didn't fight. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her absolute social and financial annihilation had completely broken her brain. She looked totally hollowed out, an incredibly old, fragile woman suddenly stripped of all her stolen power. As the police read her rights and escorted her out, her wealthy friends actively turned their backs on her, aggressively distancing themselves from the toxic scandal. Not a single person offered to help. Sarah ran through the crowd, wrapping a warm, protective arm tightly around my shoulders. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic blur of police statements, flashing lights, and terrified whispers from the remaining guests. But as I walked out of that luxury hotel and breathed in the crisp, cool night air, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 5 years finally lifted. My marketing agency was completely safe, my assets were heavily protected, and the monsters who had terrorized me were locked in cold federal holding cells. I had successfully navigated an incredibly dangerous, life-threatening labyrinth, entirely dismantling their empire brick by brick. The fairy tale was officially dead, but my actual life was just beginning. I looked at the flashing police lights and finally allowed myself to truly smile. It has been 2 incredibly healing, transformative years since that explosive charity gala. Greg violently refused to take a plea deal, aggressively fighting the charges, which only resulted in a much harsher sentence. He is currently serving 8 years in a federal penitentiary for massive fraud and domestic battery. Eleanor's precious estate was forcefully seized and liquidated by the commercial banks to cover a fraction of her massive, hidden debts. She completely lost her elite social standing, her money, and her mind, eventually moving into a tiny, state-funded assisted living facility. Neither of them has ever reached out, and Lawyer Vance ensures they legally never can. My boutique marketing agency didn't just survive, it massively thrived. Without their constant, suffocating financial drain and psychological sabotage, I expanded the business globally, hiring a massive new team. But the most profound change happened quietly inside my own mind. Extensive trauma therapy taught me that I was never responsible for their violence or their terrifying greed. I learned that abusers often target strong, successful people precisely because they desperately need to drain their light and resources. The most crucial advice I can offer anyone facing a similar nightmare is this: never, ever believe that you are trapped. Trauma bonds are incredibly powerful, and financial abuse is terrifyingly isolating, but cold, calculated patience is your greatest weapon. Document absolutely everything, quietly secure your independence, and wait for the perfect moment to strike back. You don't have to scream to win. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is a meticulously planned, utterly silent exit that leaves your abusers completely ruined. I now live in a beautiful, sunlit apartment overlooking the city, entirely free from antique cages and toxic smiles. My life is entirely my own, built on absolute truth, hard work, and unshakable resilience. I survived the absolute worst of human manipulation, and I emerged entirely unbreakable. The wall they threw me against didn't break me. It just woke me up.